The thesis, in my opinion, and it seems that there is a historical rhyme in this, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, it could not continue the subsequent pacifist position. Hence arose the theory of sacred. A just war. About a just war. Yes, a just war. And this is terrible in this, as it seems to me, I am also writing about this. There was already a certain hypocrisy, which later led to holy wars, and to the fact that they were significantly more cruel than a short period of ritual, and as it were, rational wars. Yes, I agree with you. And here it seems to me, there is a certain one, because it seems to me, this is a little bit not that level, because after all, it seems to me, the state, Christianity appeals to man. In other words, we can establish these rules of war to a greater extent at the human level. And more people on the battlefield, well, the majority, are actually ready to comply with them conditionally. Do not shoot at civilians. Do not finish off the wounded. Well, a wounded opponent. That is, to show Christian charity on a human level. There are no Christian states as such that could be Christian in the whole world. This, apparently, contradicts the state nature. That is, there is conditionally Caesarine, and there is God's. These two spheres, they are in a certain relationship, but a complete merger cannot occur. Therefore, when we try to transfer a just war to the interstate level, I agree. We rather, well, after a few iterations, come to what you call a holy war. Well, for the listeners of this article, in fact, the principle of this Manichaeism is when we, the angels of light, howl against the demons of darkness. I mean, that's what holy war is. And of course, in such a war, how will you show mercy, relatively speaking, to this, well, to the demon of darkness? No. At a time when you are trying to put a war in the zone, simply, let's say, an instrument of legal dispute resolution between the state, when other ways of resolving disputes have proved impossible, you do not need to show this emotional cruelty, even at the level of your propaganda. But there are a number of additional difficulties here that we can talk about, but in general, I would rather agree with you on this vector. And then it's interesting here, if we really have come to this Manichaeism, dualism, at the present stage of interstate relations, we are them, they are absolute evil, which, by the way, all countries demonstrate with different intensity. Absolutely, yes, this is it. But because otherwise you are, yes, again, you declared war on something very bad. That is, as Gambin would say, eccentric, extraordinary. But accordingly, the enemy must also be extraordinary. That is, as if this is again a consequence of this basic premise that war is. War is something that doesn't exist. Yeah. But, therefore, it becomes sacred. Excuse me. On the one hand, I am close to your thesis about the normalization of the war, in the sense of legal and logical, and not to pretend that it does not exist. But, the normalization of the war is terrifying in a different sense, and cannot be related to them. That's the one. The fact is that it seems that modern wars have some specifics, which in particular are pointed out very intuitively and with such a prophetic fuse by René Girard, who says that this is in general, directly a potential apocalypse every moment of a new war, simply because they will not stop because of the mechanism of constant reciprocity, and the inability to stop it. And this is in my opinion, and according to him, and it seems, and from your texts, it follows, that this is a direct consequence of the mass appeal of the Great French Revolution, and that we are in such wars that it may be difficult to stop. Perhaps in this sense, they are not normalizable. Well, here you can argue, well, that is, I agree with the general logic, and I would clarify that, of course, this is a mass appeal not by itself. That is, probably, the listeners do not understand what the essence of the mass appeal is, because the thing is familiar. It needs to be understood. Again, along historical context, there is everything. Well, now we can say three principal models when, relatively speaking, it happens, through which the formation of the army takes place. Let's call it that. Yes, that is, there is an instrument of war going on. The first one is the simplest. It's for the money. A soldier translates from Italian as someone who serves at the same time as soldo, that is, as if for money. A mercenary on a simple account. Even if it's a mercenary serving his country, the recruitment model is for the most part exactly, well, a professional army. Again, there are exceptions and additions there. For example, technically in the Russian Empire, soldiers were not paid for most of history, but the recruitment system is exactly the same as a professional mercenary army in its mechanism. They just didn't pay money yet, but it happens. But essentially the same thing. And the second historical model is the militia. In other words, these are prizes. This is when it happens extremely. That is, relatively speaking, wars can be divided into ordinary and extraordinary. In other words, an ordinary war is when you have enough of a professional army, and the militia gathers in history, when it just becomes some kind of there, something that a professional army can't handle. And then, for a very short period of time, in accordance with a certain custom or legal norm, the militia is mobilized. By the way, for example, here is the War of the 12th Year in Russia. It very well reflects this, let's say, still old mechanism of interaction of society with the war, and there it is very interesting, of course. It turned out that this old mechanism defeated the newest one, which already had war as a social technology, ideology. That is, the French one, yes. And so, in fact, what is happening in the French Revolution? In my opinion, one of these things is happening in the French Revolution. The genie is being released from the bottle, because social warfare is becoming a social technology. In other words, ideology is being invented at the same time as a simulator of religious feeling, as a simulator of holy war, and it is already possible to conduct a mass appeal under the ideology. This is very important to understand, that if there is no ideology, mass appeal is impossible. Only a professional army is possible. And this is again a general principle. When, after the French invented it, everyone began to do it at all. In other words, the Germans were the first to rationalize this in the speeches of some German nation, in the culture of the Bismarck camp. That's exactly why it was exactly way. Then the famous quote about the fact that the Battle of Sedovoya was won by a school teacher. That is, accordingly, the fact that, precisely because they successfully carried out cultural indoctrination, they made a higher quality of the conscription force. But later it became, I repeat, a general principle that really reached its limit in the Second World War, which then scared everyone. But since then, this gap has formed, which you mentioned. That is, it seems that everyone would like to fight with professional armies, but when it gets hot due to certain technological features of modern warfare, you need more or less mobilization. But here, in fact, I would urge you to be patient, because even with the example of Russia, now I'm sorry, if anything, send it. A very interesting case. It seems that there is a mobilization, but note that it does not take place in the classical one. It's just that the Russian mobilization and the Ukrainian mobilization are very well comparable. Ukrainian mobilization follows the pure scenario of the 20th century. Russian mobilization, according to a hybrid scenario. And it is quite possible that this is exactly an example of social innovation, when, on the one hand, you need a lot. In other words, an attempt to combine and create a fundamentally new type of mobilization. At the intersection of these three principles, militia, payment, and ideology. Moreover, ideology is probably the weakest of all three. In other words, this is some kind of very interesting experiment, from a scientific point of view, which, quite possibly, will be a prototype of a certain model for the 21st century, for big conflicts for other countries. We understand that the whole world is watching this now, including from the point of view of social technologies. At the same time, the basic model, which I repeat, everyone still tries to intuitively lean towards, is a professional army. But the problem is that at this level of technology, a professional army is not enough to conduct a modern war. That is, yes, you have correctly noticed the conflict here. And this is true. But do you agree that the horror in the Second World War was not accidental and not speech? The presence of nuclear weapons is also not accidental, and a certain amount of thinking, technology to prevent major wars, at least between the carriers of nuclear weapons, was undertaken, and they apparently collapsed. And I wonder why it didn't collapse. The first one. In fact, of course not. That's the point. Here you know again, I myself am a very big fan, for example, of criticizing the UN, that is, as it were, as an organization of concerned nations. But the joke, unfortunately, has very good reasons for life. But, if we seriously think about what was the purpose of it, one of at least the real ones they declared, preventing a new war between a new direct war between the great powers, then we must state that this institution copes with this task. There is no direct war between the great powers. Well, she's not. There is a proxy war tool. Of course, in my opinion, it is much more hypocritical than, relatively speaking, a direct war between the great powers, but it is much less destructive, in which you are absolutely right. That is, roughly I would. And so, let's say, thought and politics reacted in this way to this very challenge. Now something else breaks down. It is not the principle of war that is breaking now. It is the historical epoch that is breaking now. In other words, we are just now forced to touch on a slightly different topic. It is related to the fact that we have entered an era that I recommend calling the Third World 30 Years' War. That is as it were. In other words, since the world of modernity began with the 30 Years' War, this is the period of 1618th to 1648th year, and he then established these rules, according to which the main agent of international relations was the national state, regardless of its size, regardless of its status. Legally, it is the main legal entity of modern international relations. So, the whole system of modernity, including the Westphalian system of international relations, is now being closed, for a very large complex of natural reasons, in particular, about which I write and tell them in my article. Well, that's why I'm going to omit it now. Just try to believe my words for now. And we have just entered a period when new rules are being developed, because the old rules obviously don't work. There are no new rules. This is an era of uncertainty. Therefore, there will be more conflict on the outer contour. This is where it seems to me that what are you reacting to? The fact that the level of conflict has increased. But it has increased precisely because this is a period of uncertainty, when new rules are being worked out for the next, I do not know, a certain number of decades, centuries, then how it will turn out. Here I would take it this way.
Мгм.
My
Ну, я вот
concern is somewhat
немного
further than what you
немножко
rightly
дальше,
say.
чем вот, то, что вы справедливо говорите.
I understood.
Я
A
понял для
brilliant
себя первая
metaphor
часть
about the
метафоры
term, about a new 30
про
years
тему
war,
про
which should
новую
apparently, by
десятилетие войны,
analogy,
которая
end with the
должна,
peace of
видимо,
Westphalia,
по аналогии
that
с
is, with some
78
kind of
годом
rationality, a new
быть рациональной.
rationality. Well, new. Well, that is,
Новый.
perhaps
Но
already
возможно, эта
irrationality of
рациональность
another
другого
level.
уровня.
That
То
is,
есть, возможно,
perhaps,
рациональность,
rationality,
которая
which I
будет
hope will not be
действительно
blind in its
своей
rationality.
рациональностью.
This is a
То есть,
very important
рациональной.
point.
Там
There's a
огромная
huge problem
проблема,
there.
как вы
That's, as you
знаете,
know,
в
the
Испании с
Russian
тем,
system.
что они
The fact
попытались
that they tried to
рационализировать
rationalize something
принципиально
that is not
нерациональную
nationalized in
политику.
principle.
И
In
с
other
надеждой,
words,
что по
I hope
итогам этого
that as a
будет
result of
более
this, there will be a
органическая
more
система,
organic
которая
system
будет
that will
допускать
allow for a
повсюду
large zone of
степень
uncertainty,
определенности,
including conflict
степень
uncertainty,
неопределенности
but
на
according to
определенных,
certain, let's say,
скажем так,
customs. That
обычаях.
is,
То
relatively
есть,
speaking,
условно говоря,
it
мне
seems to me
кажется,
that the law of
право
war has
войны
not been
не было
supplemented
дополнено
by the custom of
обычаем
war,
войны.
and
Это
over a long
дистанция
distance, the
обычаев
custom
войны
of
имеют,
war matters
условно
an order
говоря,
of
большую
magnitude more than the right
широту.
of war. Well,
Это
this is a
вот
hypothesis.
гипотеза.
So far, I'll say it bluntly.